Get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Shavonna McCaleb, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with the name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers throughout the presentation in the chat or aloud if time is permitting. As time allows, we will also unmute folks to ask questions live. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCV grant administrators, and other consultants who can help to answer questions during a Q&A session. If we cannot answer a question, we will either get back to you or recommend that you complete a HUD AAQ. Next slide, please. Please note that both the slides and the recording will be sent to all participants within 1 week of today's session. Next slide, please. Today's office hour session agenda includes the following: ESG updates and resources, ESGCV updates, office hour update, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESGCV Q&A, and today's spotlight session is ESG and ESGCV client file checklist. And now I will hand it over to Tuesday for ESG updates.
Hi, good morning. Just a couple things that we have today. The 2023 ESG annual NOFA is the COC awards have been announced, and some of them have even started routing. The BLS awards we expect to have announced sometime later this month, and that should be done soon, we're hoping. Next slide. And as always, here we are, Diana Prado, Sam Liu, Giovanni, Anthony Zepeda, and myself, Tuesday Cool. You can reach us at our emails or at the ESG NOFA box at esgnofa@hcdca.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuesday. And now for ESGCV updates. Reminder for performance milestones. CV1 and CV2 allocation grant agreements expired on December the 31st, 2023. ESGCV additional funds timeline. Final drawdown deadline is March 31st, 2024. Final RFF deadline is April the 15th, 2024. And the agreement expiration date is June 30th, 2024. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hours include the following topics: 214, emergency and night-by-night shelter; 221, understanding indirect costs; 228, ESG monitoring checklist; 36, client eligibility and service by ESG component; 313, leveraging and braiding funds. Next slide, please. At this time, are there any questions? If not, next slide, please. How to contact us. If you have further questions, please contact us for annual ESG. Please reach out to your ESG representative or esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. For ESGCV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Now, let's turn our attention to today's Spotlight series, Client File Checklist, featuring myself, Shavonna McCaleb, and Kristen Delkamp. Kristen, I'll turn it over.
Good morning, everybody. This is Kristen Delkamp, and I am an ESGCV grant administrator. I live in Orange County, California, and I'm very excited to be here co-facilitating with Shavonna. Shavonna, I'll hand it back to you.
Hello again, and again, my name is Shavonna McCaleb. My pronouns are she, her. I live in the Georgia area, and I am a grant administrator for ICF. Next slide. Now for our presentation. Client file documentation. We will discuss the following and what each consists of: eligibility, need, initial evaluation, reevaluation, assistance provided, termination of assistance, compliance, and accountability. Next slide. The overview. Both ESG and ESG-CV have participant record keeping requirements. These requirements ensure that all records are maintained for all assisted persons, including persons screened and found ineligible. This presentation will help you to understand the requirements for documentation as well as the tools available from California HCD for setting up and maintaining client files. Next slide, please. Client file record keeping requirements. The ESG Interim Rule 24 CFR Section 576.500 requires documentation of homelessness for the following components: street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing. Documentation of at-risk of homelessness status for the following components: homelessness prevention. Documentation of annual income. For homelessness prevention, income is required at time of intake and is 30% AMI per HUD policy and not less than every 3 months for reevaluation. Rapid rehousing does not have income requirements at the time of initial evaluation, but does require income annually when recertified. Your community may have policies that require income for assessing income outside of HUD's annual requirement. It is important that in this case, you must follow your policy. Documentation of services and assistance provided to the program participant. You would document it in HMIS, case notes, and case file. Ensuring compliance with all the required documents such as lead-based paint, VAWA, fair market rent, etc. for the applicable components. When terminating assistance, it is important to give the participant notice in a timely manner before you end the services. Next slide, please. Program participant records policy. For each program participant, you want to utilize a relevant client file checklist for each participant screened for assistance. Checklists are intended to support subrecipients in obtaining documentation, as well as checklists can also be another way of a checks and balance. We have discussed how each participant receiving ESG should have a file with the required documentation. However, it is just as important to maintain the file throughout the time the participant is receiving assistance. While California HCD checklists are optional and a great guide for staff, subrecipients can develop their own checklists. You just want to ensure that your checklist requires all the necessary requirements for each component. The link to access the CAESG subrecipient program manual will be in the slides when emailed. Next slide, please. Next, we will go over some key sections on the checklist. The first one is case information. You want to ensure that all fields are complete on this section. On this screen, you will see that for ESG program, we are referring to homelessness prevention. However, if you are using a checklist that has all of the components, you want to check the one that applies to that participant. For agency and program name, for this example, the agency name is Good Neighbor. However, the program name is Safe Haven Emergency Shelter. A lot of times when the program is listed in HMIS, it might be listed by the program name. Head of household, client ID. For confidentiality purposes, this is what you should how you should identify the client, whether you are emailing or sending information regarding the client. You never want to use the PII, such as the participant name, date of birth, etc. You want to use the HMIS client ID. Client status. Is the client new to the program? continuing, or ineligible. You want to ensure that one of those is checked. Next slide, please. Household information. You want to ensure that the date the information is collected and when the form is put in the file is on the checklist. It is important to note that screening for coordinated entry, or CES as it is generally called, and the intake is completely different. CES follow your community's adopted CES process. For HMIS intake, the community in which enrolling the client for services. This process can be done in real time and or in the field and later input into HMIS. The community should have a policy for if the intake is not done in real time. What is the timeline in which the case manager should enter that information in HMIS? For further information on HMIS, please reference the ESG program HMIS manual. Next slide, please. This section is documenting verification of homeless or at risk of homeless status. Again, the following components require documentation of literally homeless, street outreach, emergency shelter, and rapid rehousing. And documentation for at-risk is for homelessness prevention. Next slide. Ineligibility. For those participants that are screened and deemed ineligible, you still want to keep a file with documentation of the reason for that determination. The participant must also be given a copy of an official letter with the determination and appeals process. You may not know if the participant is ineligible until you complete a needs assessment, which we'll go over on the next slide. For further information on ineligibility, please reference 24 CFR 576-500D, and the link will be provided in this slide. Next slide, please. The needs assessment determines participant eligibility and what services they may need. An example of this is if you're enrolling a participant into rapid rehousing, the needs may be financial and or ongoing rental assistance. Again, the evaluation must be conducted in accordance with your community's adopted CES requirements. Next slide, please. For each component that you see on this slide, street outreach, emergency shelter, and rapid rehousing, we have listed activities that will help you comply with requirements and have the documents in the case file. I wanted to note that this is also a good tool for internal monitoring. Sometimes it's referred to spot check. You can determine if the case file has the required documents, when it was complete, and when is the next follow-up is due, if applicable. For components in which you are making payments on behalf of the client, example, rapid rehousing, European rental assistance, you want to make sure that proof of payment is in that client file. Also, remember, all payments must be made third party, i.e. to the landlord, or if it's for emergency shelter, paid directly to the hotel and never to the client. Next slide, please. Termination of assistance. I think it is important to note termination is different from discharge. Discharge, in most cases, is planned and a timeline is projected with the participant. Or in some cases, discharge can be if the participant voluntarily leaves the project. Termination in general is if the participant violates program rules, the subrecipient may terminate the assistance in accordance with the formal process established by the subrecipient. What that means is each community should have a written policy on termination that recognizes the rights of individuals affected. The subrecipient must exercise judgment and examine all extenuating circumstances in determining when violations warrant termination, so that the participant assistant is terminated only in the most severe cases. Again, you want to avoid terminating assistance at all costs. However, if you do have to, you want to make sure it is for the most severe violation. Program participants receiving assistance or housing relocation and stabilization services to terminate rental assistance or housing relocation and stabilization services for a program participant. It is required the formal process and at a minimum must consist of written notice to the program participant containing a clear statement of the reason for termination, a review of the decision in which the program participant is given the opportunity to present written or oral objections before a person other than the person who made or approved the termination decision. So this means the person above them. And notice of this termination must be given promptly to the participant. And now I will hand it over to Kristen.
Thank you, Shavana. Everybody, I am so happy to see you here today. Shavana is going to actually drop a link into the chat because what we're going to do is we are going to take the Rapid Rehousing client file checklist for a test drive. So if you want to follow along with the slides, you can, or if you want to jump straight into the checklist itself, we can follow along that way. But let's go ahead and get started. So this is Shavana gave the overviews and the highlights of each section in her presentation. I'm going to talk about what you are wanting to focus on in the checklist itself. So we've got a whole bunch of areas highlighted here. We don't necessarily need to cover all of them because a lot of them are self-explanatory. But I do want to point out, and this is something that Shavana mentioned, that you'll notice that we've got head of household client ID on this slide, not the name. This is so that we can protect PII. You may have other people that are looking into the file. So you want to go with the head of household client ID. As well, you want to make sure you've got the HMIS intake form in the file and the HMIS release of information that your organization administers. And then the intake or the screening form for coordinated entry. So these are going to get us started with what we want to see in our rapid rehousing client file checklist. Next, we're going to be looking at eligibility. So for rapid rehousing, we want to focus on category 1 and category 4 of the homeless definition. If you have an individual or a household that's entering via category 1, that means that they are literally homeless. So that means they are living in a place unfit for human habitation, perhaps cohabitating with friends or family, but they won't be able to do that anymore. Whatever the situation might be when they're literally homeless, we want to document as follows. We want to follow the preferred order for literally homelessness documentation as set out by HUD. So that means third party certification that's been written or oral. So that might be a case manager that writes out a statement, signs and dates it, perhaps even a street outreach case manager. Then the next in order would be staff observations. So you as a staff member may be the one filling out the observation instead of receiving that third party written certification, or self-certification by the client is always acceptable. So if that is the certification and the documentation that you're going to be including, then that is okay. You'll notice throughout the checklists that we've got links that we've included. And this is so that if you have any questions about what you're looking at, we wanted you to have the resources easily accessible. So we've got a combination of HUD and California HCD links to help fill in the information about the preferred order for literally homeless documentation. Now, if you're talking about category 4, which is clients that are fleeing domestic violence and entering the rapid rehousing project, there are two different sort of paths for documenting that. One would be a client that comes in specifically through a victim service provider. If that instance, the intake would include an oral statement that confirms they're fleeing, have no subsequent residence, and that they lack the resources to have a safe and decent shelter. We're going to get a lot of people, though, who are coming in through non victim service provider intake, in which case, if they are presenting themselves as a category 4 homeless household or individual, there are a couple of things that we need. We want to have an oral statement that confirms that they're fleeing. And that can be either self certification by the individual or head of household or by the intake worker, certification that no subsequent residence has been identified, so they have no other place to go, and self certification or other written documentation that the household lacks financial resources and support networks to obtain other permanent housing. So that is what we're looking at in terms of initially establishing eligibility for rapid rehousing clients. Now, it might be that ineligibility is what comes out of your eligibility certification process. If that's the case, then we're going to want to see um, usually the letter that is provided to the client or the applicant saying why they were ineligible, which should include the documentation of the reason. Now, if they are deemed eligible, then we want to get into needs. So, what is it that they need to stabilize in housing? For rapid rehousing, keep in mind that we're not talking about prevention, that's homelessness prevention. So, we're talking about people that already qualify under categories 1 and 4. And it could be diversion, but most often we're looking at rapid exit. Rapid exit is similar to diversion, except that rapid exit usually provides more case management over a longer period of time to help someone become stably housed. And of course, the backbone of rapid exit is strengths based, housing focused case management. Other relevant service documentation and amounts can include things like mediation, moving costs, limited legal services, etc. In terms of housing stability plan and service and linkages provided, we already mentioned other relevant service documentation and amounts, but we also want to see in that file the housing stability plan. And that is a living document that can change based on the situation. And that's tied very closely to related case management documentation. So we want to see the case manager's notes in the file. And again, rapid exit services provided and any other relevant service documentation and amounts. Next, we're looking at an income and rent determination. Keep in mind that if we are looking at rapid rehousing, no income verification is needed for initial assistance under rapid rehousing. The determination is going to be for the rent calculation. What portion will the client be paying in rent? When it comes to reevaluation, HUD requires reevaluation annually. You may have a policy that requires it more frequently. If that's the case, you need to stick with your policy and not with HUD's policy. But at the time of recertification, that participant must be at 30% or under of the area median income. In terms of the unit, what we want to see in the file is we want to see habitability standards. We've got two checklists that are linked here. One is HUD's and one is California HCD's. Come this fall, HUD is going to be changing to Inspire. We don't have more information on that yet, but when we do, any Inspire checklists will be linked in this document. And of course, lead-based paint. So we know that units that were built 1978 or earlier have some additional things that they need when it comes to lead-based paint. Everybody should be getting the HUD lead-based paint acknowledgement form and protect your family from lead in your home. But you may also need to do, based on the year that the home was built, a lead-based paint visual assessment. We want to see that in the file. We want to see all of those things. You don't need to put the protect your family from lead in your home pamphlet in, but we do want to see that this is checked off and that that has been distributed to the client or household. If the participant received rental and or financial assistance, the following is required. So, a residential lease agreement. We want to see leases in the file, and that lease needs to be signed by the participant and the landlord. It needs to be dated. We want to see the dates of the lease term in there, and it needs to address any late payment requirements. Keeping in mind that there are two types of rental assistance, tenant based and project based, there are slightly different requirements for each of those. So, first off, if you have tenant based rental assistance, there's no minimum lease length or rental assistance agreement required. However, if you have project based rental assistance, which is, I think, what we typically see with ESG, then we do want to see that the lease and the rental assistance agreement have an initial term of 1 year, even if you're not providing rental assistance for the entire year. This is a big one, payments made on behalf of the participant. Many of you have gone through monitoring in the last year, whether that's been ESG or ESGCV, and that is something that we see a lot of people get dinged on. We actually want to make sure that there is proof of the rental assistance payments made to owners on behalf of the participant. So that is usually going to be a copy of the check that was provided to the landlord. And we want to know about the dates and term that the payments covered, the dates of occupancy by the program participants. And so that ties into the lease, as well as any other supporting documentation, um, including the rental assistance agreement. So, the rental assistance agreement is the agreement that an agency signs with the landlord that lays out what exactly they'll be providing in terms of rental assistance versus what the client's responsibility is for rent. And so, we want to make sure that the rental assistance agreement agrees with the lease, that it's got the same payment due date, the same grace period and the same late payment requirements. And that, again, we want to clarify how much is paid by the program participant as well as how much is paid by the program. Please keep in mind that the rental assistance agreement needs to be executed before any payments are issued to the landlord. And just to reiterate what Shavana said earlier, any payments always go to the source, whether it's the landlord, whether it's the utility company, or otherwise, they do not go to the participant. Okay, fair market rent and rent reasonableness certification. These are requirements that HUD sets out. And so you will want to click into the fair market rent and rent reasonableness certification form. That will produce the form that you will be putting into the file. And again, you are wanting to document that the rent is aligned with similar rents in the area. And then VAWA documentation. When it comes to VAWA, everybody who is signing a lease that involves rental assistance will have the VAWA lease amendment as part of the lease documentation. That is a requirement by HUD. In addition, everyone who signs a lease or is part of the program will be receiving the VAWA notice of occupancy rights as well as the VAWA victim certification form. Those are forms HUD 5380 and 5382. Those are currently undergoing a revision at this time, but you can still use those forms until the revised forms come out. And then keep in mind that the HUD forms 5380 and 5382 are distributed at several points throughout the life cycle of a client being in the program. So you want to distribute those when an applicant is denied ESG rental assistance, when an applicant's application for a unit receiving project-based rental assistance is denied, when a participant begins receiving ESG rental assistance, when a person is notified of termination of ESG rental assistance, and when a participant receives notification of eviction. Finally, under the VAWA section, we have the emergency transfer request. Every community needs to have an emergency transfer plan. That may be at the community level, that may be at the agency level. But what that sets out is that if there is an instance of domestic violence that causes the client to feel that they are in danger if they stay in their unit, or if there has been a sexual assault within the unit within the most recent 90 calendar days, that those tenants have a right to switch to a different unit. So that we want to make sure that if we're doing that, that VAWA emergency transfer request is getting filled out and included in the file. And moving on to financial assistance tracking, again, we want to make sure that we're documenting all of the items that ESG or ESGCV are paying for. So that could include moving and or relocation costs. That could include utilities. That could include mediation. That could include credit repair. Whatever it might be, we want to be tracking that in the file. Your case notes should complement what we're seeing in terms of documentation of sums of money that have been expended. All right, since this is rapid rehousing, we do have a reevaluation section. And again, that reevaluation needs to be done either annually or if your own policies and procedures say more often, then that it needs to be done more frequently. I'll note that we've got the section that says included updates to the following sections 1 through 5. So that's everything. You're going to basically want to redo this sheet again so that you can make sure that we've got everything needed for a complete file that will pass muster during monitoring. And then finally, termination of assistance. So, termination of assistance, we are talking about notice of termination of ESG services, a termination of assistance appeal in the case that a client wants to appeal the termination of assistance, and then any other supporting documentation of compliance with termination. So, really, that's your policies and procedures. Why did you make the determination that this client's assistance will be terminated? You want that to match up with your written documentation in the way that you operate. And then finally, we've got a signature section for the project staff completing the form. And again, this is a living document, so you may have more than one signature on there. And then it's a best practice to have a supervisor or a manager sign off on the files and periodically be checking the files, because otherwise, through monitoring, we will be checking the files and we may find some things that could be surprises otherwise. So I'm going to turn it over to this eyeball popper of a slide. So these are the links. You'll have all of these links to the client file checklists. And these will come to you when I send out the presentation a little bit later this week. But in the meantime, go ahead and just move it to our last section here and see if there are any questions. I'm going to take the slides down, but see if there are any questions that we can answer for anyone. Chris, did we have any questions?
There are 3 questions we're going to talk to, but I first wanted to say something. You were talking about the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, the emergency transfer plans. I just wanted to put a plug in that we are developing a learning cohort just for VAWA that is going to be released shortly. So I wanted folks just to keep their eyes on that. Kathy asks a question, and I'm going to have to scroll up. So give me 1 second to go back. We are an emergency shelter, and only some of our case managers are ESG funded. There are occasions when we have to switch case managers to a non-ESG funded case manager. What is the best way to document this? Basically, ESG funded is stopped, but the client is still receiving emergency services. Shivana, I believe you were taking a crack at the answer in writing. So would you like to verbally go ahead and answer that?
Yes, thanks, Kathy. I think best practices is you're always going to want to document it in HMIS. You also want to document it in the client file, as well as I know for ESG-CV and I believe for annual ESG, when you are submitting for reimbursement for a case manager's time, it should be documented on that case manager's time sheet, the time that they have allocated towards ESG-CV. This will help us. So especially if they're not 100%, but let's say maybe they're 10%, 20%, you want to make sure that it is documented on the timesheet as well.
Kristen, anything to add to that wonderful answer from Siobhan?
No, there's nothing I could add.
All right. The real Veronica Wilson asked a question as well, building upon Kathy's question, but she's going to focus this instead of ESG on our emergency shelter on rapid rehousing. So we have a person in rapid rehousing. Do we need to record anything in HMIS when ESG funding stops for rapid rehousing projects and they have multiple funding sources? If so, what do we do? And if no one wants to answer, I can. I just didn't want to be presumptuous.
Again, documentation is going to be your key. So you want to note in HMIS again that ESG funding source has stopped, and then you want to add the funding source. So we do see this, we have seen this. So again, for reimbursement, when you send it, if a portion of it, you're gonna put what ESG paid for, so that it is clearly seen. And if you are monitored, this also needs to be clear in your file.
Kristen, anything to
I have nothing to add, but do you have anything to add, Chris?
I'm going to add a little something else. See, Veronica has her hand raised, so I'm going to try to unmute her. Obviously, stopping someone's service in rapid housing and ESG, but they haven't actually moved units. We want to make sure that that continuity in your data and continuity in your care is there. It doesn't look like they became homeless to go back into the program. So it's going to be really dependent on your policy and procedures and your HMS solution, how you make that happen without a big problem. I am going to try to unmute. There we go. The real Veronica. There you are, Veronica. Go ahead and ask your question. I think you're okay to do so.
Can you hear me?
There you are.
Excellent. So this may be specific only to 2 providers in our community with ESG CV, because they're annual ESG recipients. So when we received the CARES Act funds, they already had projects in HMIS. And so instead of creating a separate project for CV, we just added that funding source through guidance with y'all. So now I'm going back through the monitoring and I'm having to report documentation on people that were served by ESG CV. But not all the clients in HMIS were served with CV funding. Sometimes it was just regular ESG. And I've got documentation to back it up that the only money that was ever spent was like a deposit or maybe rental assistance. So that's first, the part of it is to set that up. If it was a different funding source, I could just enter them into a different project. Do I need to distinguish that in HMIS for CV versus annual?
I am not 100% positive on your question, Veronica, so I would love for you and I just to have a quick conversation and try to figure this out. I think I know the answer, but I'm not willing to put it out there today in this format. Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine. I'll reach out. Thank you.
Yeah, just send me an email. I will get you an official response. My guess is I can find an AEQ that actually answers this and I can just hand it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. Veronica also asks about a rental assistance agreement template that California HCD has produced. I looked, I don't remember writing one. I couldn't find one. We don't have one. I can confirm with Kristen's shaking head that we do not have. All right, question from Trisha. For victims of domestic violence, I'm not sure what SA means, so I'm just going to pass over it.
Sexual assault.
Oh, thank you. For victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, if their name is on the rental agreement, where they were living at the time of, I'm assuming, a domestic violence sexual abuse incident, but don't want to file an order to kick out the offender, can we still provide assistance through rapid rehousing? Kristen,
Yes.
anything on your VAWA stuff? I'm going to go ahead and just let you crack at that one.
Yes, absolutely. As long as they still qualify under ESG and ESGCV, we can continue to provide assistance through rapid rehousing. I was involved in a really interesting conversation yesterday about this, the fact that ESG, ESGCV, and really all of HUD's programs put us in a position where we may not like some of the things that our clients do, but that doesn't mean that we cannot serve them. So, in answer to this question, yes, if the person that was abused does not want to ask their abuser to leave, we would continue with the assistance.
Thank you, Kristen. All right. Any further questions? We have a few minutes left. Love to take them if you have them. If not, love to give you some time back in your day as well. I know we're all very busy. All right, I'm not seeing any. Shavana, would you like to close us out today?
Sure will. Again, well, thank you to Kristen and myself for presenting today. A survey will pop up as you exit the session. Please be sure to answer so that we'll know the types of trainings that you're interested in receiving. Again, we want to thank you for your attendance today, and we'll see you next week.